Who were the Athenians and the Spartans, and how have they shaped our world? Although we tend to think of ancient Greece as a unified culture, Athens and Sparta are dramatically different cultures, both of which had major impacts on the development of the Western world. The 3 points are: 1. Sparta was a highly organized society devoted to equality. 2. Athens was an innovative society which developed many tools we use today. And 3. Together, Athens and Sparta provided a foundation for the Western world. So, point 1, Sparta. So, Spartan culture emerged as a distinct culture because they took over many of the lands previously owned by the Mycenaeans. One of the reasons that Spartan was essentially founded is because they had too many slaves from all these wars, and so a man named Lycurgus came to power. And in order to take care of this issue, he created kind of a new social class division, a new social structure. So essentially, it had two levels of society. There were the slaves, and there were the Spartans. And the slaves did all of the work, essentially, and the Spartans didn't really do any work, except that they were the ones who would fight in wars. Besides that, all the time, they basically just worked out. So there was one more level, too. It was kind of a middle-class level. It was called the Pararchy, I think. And this was mostly consistent of merchants and people like that. Merchants and tradesmen. While the slaves mainly worked the farms. So one of the things Lycurgus did when he took over is he made the money into brittle iron rods. And they were made brittle by quenching them in vinegar. Essentially, this, compared to their old money, which would be made of more precious metals, it made it a lot more worthless, and so it took a lot more to buy anything. As well as that, they were very large, in an awkward shape, and very fragile. So this made for a rapid decrease in commerce, which led to a great increase in equality between the Spartan class. So this made it very hard to leave as well, because once you have this money, if you had spent your whole life using this money, once you leave Sparta, it's basically worthless. Because in Sparta, people only use it because it's the only thing. In the rest of the world, it has no value, really, and it's very inefficient. So because of this, they had not really any luxuries. Well, they had luxuries, but, no one above the other. And there wasn't really any division, except for the class divisions before. So between the Spartans, the highest class themselves, they were basically all the same. And this was kind of the goal of Lycurgus. Another way he did this was to have a common mess, which was where they all ate together. And they ate very simple meals usually. And so what this did was it prevented, the wealthier free people from just eating at home, with all their servants and their comfy couches. I don't know how they ate. But, and then, you have poor people just eating more normally. If you all eat together, it kind of creates like this sense of you're all on the same level. Because, whether or not we think about it, the way we eat really defines partially our status. So they would all eat together in a common mess hall. They would usually eat simple meals. Quite often they ate black broth, which was basically just blood soup. And they had many communal things, such as basically everything was communal. Communal raising of children, communal marriage, death. Nothing was really private. It was all public, essentially. So when they would raise young children, the infants, after they were first born, would not be swaddled. The infant would not be swaddled. This was because they thought it promoted more of a sense of self-sufficiency, and it would make them stronger. So boys, when they got up to 7 years old, they would go to kind of public school, you could say, and that would be until they're about 30 years old, which they would go back home to their wife. They would be married at that point and go to their own household. But during this school, they would do. It was a very rigorous essentially way of bringing up children. They would often not feed the children enough, and this would force them to be clever, and they'd have to steal food. They would teach the children to talk very shortly and be concise. One of the things they would do is they would have kind of like a public whipping, and they would whip the boys while they tried to get cheese. Kind of like a strange sport, I guess, while many people would come to watch this. Another interesting thing they did with these people is called crypteia. I'm sorry. And this was when a boy got old enough to graduate, they would do this. So usually, as I said, it was young men who had just kind of graduated, so to speak, and you could sign up to take part in the crypteia. And it was kind of like a season, essentially, and you just get to kill any slaves you want. That's kind of what it is. You just have to rack up as many kills. It's kind of like a way to flex and just like demonstrate your skills and prowess. So essentially what they did was, you'd have these young graduates, they could come and they could sign up, and then they'd have to use knives, and they would essentially declare ritual war, and then they could just go kill slaves. So that was kind of interesting. Really highlights a strong division between the social classes. As for the women, that was the boys, the women are independently educated by their families. Kind of differently from many cultures, the women were actually allowed to own property, and they were actually taught to manage it and things like that. But they were still seen as their job being predominantly to raise children. So essentially, this was kind of the process of marriage. When women were getting married, they would cut their hair real short. And essentially what marriage was the men would sneak out of the house to go see their women at night. Or out of the house, not the house, I'm sorry, the public school thing. And they would do that. They were kind of expected to do this even though they technically weren't supposed to. There wasn't really another way to see your wife at that point until you got to be about 30 years old, when you would be able to move back home. And then when you were married, the husband would give the wife a farm. This is one of the reasons this is really interesting, but many widows would often be very rich because they would have multiple farms. And this would give them a lot of power. And they could often, own like these massive plantations and things like this. And so that was kind of how like their marriage worked. And so again, as I said before, they were encouraged to have a very short speech. This was kind of meant to be part of the culture. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed something. Oh yeah, so when they got married, the men were really expected to get married. They also had no laws about adultery, really. So men just did a lot of stuff. So much so that in Sparta, it was actually, they considered it like a really bad thing if you had never like married anyone. So Leonardo Controlli says, quote, "In Sparta, celibacy was a crime. Street gangs of women were allowed to beat up bachelors," end quote. So that's interesting. That kind of points to a more practical idea of marriage, just to produce children. Okay. On to point 2. Athens. So there was a man named Solon, and he was kind of analogous to Lycurgus in many ways. He was kind of the starter of Athens. Athens was very famously a democracy. But in that time, that was a lot different than what we think today. They were ruled essentially, they had a council of 500 people, which was just an assembly of essentially random people. What they would do is they would have like kind of like a lottery, and they would just pick random people, and then those 500 people would get to be on the council. And then as well as that, they would have councils of smaller amounts of people who were more, who were elected and things like that. But essentially, so that was just kind of how they kept things like democratic. They were very big on freedom of speech. Unlike the Spartans, who like to be very concise and talk very shortly, they just loved to talk a lot, I guess. They were very thoughtful and talkative. So, as for their culture surrounding birth and children, they had a very high mortality rate, so the baby was not named till 7 to 10 days after they were born. This contrasts a lot with the Spartans, who would sometimes kill babies they thought to be